This is the Nursing Home Abuse Podcast, Episode 84, How to Read Georgia Nursing Home Inspection Reports. The Nursing Home Abuse Podcast is dedicated to providing news and information for families whose loved ones have been injured in a nursing home. Here are your hosts, Georgia attorneys Rob Schenk and Will Smith. Hello out there and welcome back. My name is Rob Schenk.
And I'm William Smith.
And we are your co-hosts for this episode of the Nursing Home Abuse Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about how to read inspection reports and reports by the government of nursing homes and how to understand what a statement of deficiency is and what that means in terms of the care that the residents at a particular nursing home receive. And this is kind of like a to be continued episode. Actually, this is the second part of a to be continued episode because we're having again to the podcast Richard Mollot. Last week we talked about how you can use the website Nursing Home Compare, which is a government, it's a website operated by the government that provides scores to nursing homes around the country. And we talked about, if you didn't listen, it's a great episode, but we talked about how to use that website to maneuver through and discover information about nursing homes across the country. And one of the pieces of information that you can get from this website are the various inspections conducted by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Studies, or Services, that when their periodic inspections. You can access these through that website. And today, but it took a long time, today we're going to have Richard Mollot back on the show to guide us through what that inspection report looks like, how to understand what statement of deficiencies are, and what you can do with that information. Will, please take the mic away from me and tell us about who Richard Mollot is.
So we've had Richard on the show numerous times in the past. He's the executive director of the Long-Term Care Community Coalition, which is the LTCCC. It's a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving care for seniors and the disabled through legal and policy research, advocacy, and education. He also runs the website Nursing Home 411, which is a phenomenal website that if you have a loved one in a long-term care setting, you have to go to Nursing Home 411 and check it out and use it in conjunction with other information that's out there on picking a nursing home. Richard's a graduate of Howard University School of Law. He is an attorney, and he's a member of the Maryland Bar. Esquire. So we're very fortunate to have him on here yet again.
Richard, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me back again.
All right. Okay.
All right, Richard, thanks for coming back. And the last time you were on here, we went over the Nursing Home Compare site, which is the government website from CMS, from Medicare.gov, that has the different data, that has the different, it's the staffing levels or the quality measures. But the other thing that it had on there is that you can look at these statement of deficiency sheets that have got, somebody's made a complaint or for some reason the state's going out there to inspect. And you're going to go over one of these now. Is that right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And so what are we looking at here?
Oh, and I haven't mentioned this yet. I'm so sorry. This is another one of those picture pages episodes of the Nursing Home Abuse Podcast. So it's going to be a treat for the viewer of the show because we're going to be taken through. The screen will be lit up with the information that Richard is referring to. And again, if you watch this episode, you'll be able to see everything that Richard is doing. Okay, Richard, sorry. Go ahead.
Great. No, thanks very much. So again, we're looking at the statement of deficiencies for the Pruitt Health Facility in Virginia Park, of course, in Georgia. So these statements of deficiencies, as you guys were just saying, they are essentially the record showing what deficiencies were found when the nursing home was last inspected. And that could be for what's typically an annual inspection, or it could be an inspection or what we call a survey as a result of a complaint. So what the statements of deficiency does is, and this is for every single nursing home, and again, every time there is an inspection in which there are any what we call deficiencies, which is really a citation for a violation of a minimum standard of care, and the federal government calls them deficiencies. What you'll see in these statements of deficiencies are a explanation of what the citation was for, what the standard was that was violated, and how it was violated. It's really important to understand as you approach these, and we had talked about this last week, that the Nursing Home Compare website has the last 3 years of the statements of deficiencies, and it has the citations, et cetera, so you can see the number of citations, and then, as we're talking about today, you can see the actual statements. But it's a way to kind of dig a little bit deeper into what is going on in your nursing home. It's really important, as I mentioned last week, to note that the states tend to do a very poor job in identifying problems and in what we call scoping them appropriately. So just to take a moment to discuss that, as I mentioned last week, the nursing homes, most people, I can't think of anyone who wants to go to a nursing home, to be honest, unless they absolutely have to. Yeah. And the reason for that is because there are very persistent and widespread problems that we and the government agencies and academics have all tracked year after year after year. What this does, and what the website does, and then here in the statements of deficiencies, is that you can see exactly what is going on, or what was found to be going on. And that's very important in your nursing home. And so the distinction I'm trying to make is that this may not have everything, that it might not have every problem. It has the problems that the surveyor saw, and that he or she was able to, what they call, substantiate.
Okay.
So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the further on. But now why don't we go to one of these documents? Again, this is the Pruitt Health. This is the last inspection for their Virginia Park facility. It took place on March 15, 2018. And if you're looking, this looks to me, and I've been doing this for close to 20 years now. At first, I remember being very intimidated by these statements of deficiencies, because you can see that they're rather dense.
Yeah.
But what I have come to, just in looking at them over the years, I see them as telling a story and explaining exactly what was found when they citing a deficiency. Why is this really important and valuable to residents and families and anyone who's working with them, is that you can see exactly what problem has been identified. So again, you're not seeing every problem identified. I just want to make that very, very clear. But you're seeing when a problem was identified by the inspector, when it was substantiated, and how. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skim through. So you can see in bold at the top of this page, it says, honor the residents' right to organize and participate in resident family groups in the facility. And then on the left-hand column, there's an F number. That's 0565. That's what's called the F tag. So for every provision in the federal regulations, there's an accompanying F tag. It's basically the number that the surveyor assigns. And we use that number a lot. So we can see how many facilities were cited, for example, F565. And then underneath that, underneath the F565 in bold, it says level of harm and residents affected. And that's what I meant when I said that nursing home surveyors tend to do a poor job in adequately scoping the level of harm and the effect that these violations have had on residents. So what I've done is I've highlighted, the L you'll see is highlighting just for purposes of our discussion. It doesn't usually show up that way. But again, the statements of deficiencies are useful to see what has been identified as a problem in your facility and exactly what the facility is expected to be doing. So if you are a family member or a resident, or if you're working with residents and families or consulting with them, you can get an idea of what has been going on in this facility, at least what has been found, substantiated by the government as some of the problems, and then address them to the extent that you might be interested or concerned. So if you are a family member or a resident participating in a resident or family council, these can be issues that you can raise with the facility, things that you might want to be aware of. And if you're an attorney or working with residents or families or an advocate in some way, to know what is going on and what issues might be of concern. So what I've done here is I took one of the shorter ones, frankly, because I wanted to make sure that we had time to give it some framework. And this again was that the facility had failed, and it's here in bold, develop the complete care plan within 7 days of the comprehensive assessment, and to have that prepared, reviewed, and revised by a team of health professionals. So I'm not sure where we cut off before. As I mentioned before, the planning, the assessment of a resident and the planning of his or her care are really essential. And they sound like they may be things that are not that important. But as I mentioned before, there was a major federal study that was done a couple of years ago that found for Medicare beneficiaries specifically that 1/3 of them were harmed within about 2 weeks of entering a nursing home. This was a national study.
Yeah.
And so why is that important? One, it indicates that there is it shows how important it is to have a proper understanding of what a resident's needs are through an assessment, and how important it is to have a care plan that appropriately and adequately addresses the needs that have been identified either clinically or by speaking to a resident or his or her representatives in that process, and that the care plan must be, and the assessments both must be updated whenever needed. So if there's a change in how a resident is functioning, if there's a clinical change, et cetera, that those things are to be addressed in this way. And that's part of the federal requirements, which is what we're talking about here.
Right. And so I see we have the violation of that federal requirement is highlighted, but then take us through, and I was going to ask this before, but there's a whole lot of dialogue underneath the bolded citation. And you've highlighted a portion of that starting with during the interview. So take us through, what information is this and who is putting it in here?
So this is all done by the state surveyor. So just to provide a little backdrop, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the federal agency, they pay for all Medicare and Medicaid services no matter where they're provided. And in the nursing home world, if you, what we call participate in Medicare or Medicaid, you have to meet these standards for every single one of your residents. So once you're in the Medicare or Medicaid world as a facility, all of your residents, whether they're private pay, whether they're paid for by Medicaid, whether their care is paid for by Medicare, whether their Uncle Jack pays for their care, it doesn't matter. Every resident has a right to every service that we talked about in the federal requirements. And so this really tells you exactly how those rights are not being realized for the residents. So the statements of deficiencies are written by the state surveyors. CMS contracts with the state agencies. In Georgia, I think it's the Department of Community Health.
Yes.
And so they essentially contract with those states to ensure that nursing homes are meeting the standards of care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days out of the year. The way that they do it is through annual inspections and through responding to complaints. Now, as many people realize, the reason why we're here is because, unfortunately, the states don't do a very good job of quality assurance, and too much nursing home care is, to put it nicely, not very good.
Yeah.
So that brings us to where we are today, which is, okay, let's see, what we're looking at is, what did the state identify when they came in? and how do they identify it, and how is that instructive to what we are seeing and concerned about in our facility? So here again, with this one deficiency, and there are 11 that are covered in this because they had a lot of deficiencies this past March, but this is one, and it relates to the comprehensive assessment and care planning, which are again so important. So what they did here is they said that this is the first paragraph, that they failed to provide this for 2 of a sample of 24 residents. And they describe what they found for each resident and how they, what is called, substantiated the deficiency. Substantiated the facility was out of compliance with the minimum care standard. So here, and you'll see, it also makes it a little bit difficult. I just try to ignore it, but they want to make sure that they don't divulge anyone's personal information. So you'll see a lot of information is redacted. They never use anyone's name. So the first one, number 1, is resident number 46. They just assign a number to that person. And essentially what I highlighted here is during an interview conducted with resident 46 in her room on March 12th, she stated that she had not been invited to attend a care plan meeting to discuss her plan of care since her admission the previous October.
Wow.
So we're talking, right.
Yeah.
Resident 46 stated that she had never had a conversation with any of the staff members regarding care plan meetings, her care plan. She did not know what they were. Resident 46 is listed as her own responsible party. And it says in the paragraph before, I didn't highlight, that she is cognitively intact and able to make decisions about her daily living.
So
there was no reason.
Short, I was going to say, in short, there's no reason not to believe what she's saying.
There's no reason not to believe what she's saying, and also no reason that she would not have been included.
Correct.
In those conversations. And this gets at, as part of that care planning and part of that resident, both the care planning and the resident assessment, is that federal law requires that the resident or his or her representative are there and able to take part in contributing. It should all be centered on them, and particularly on the resident. But again, if the resident can't speak or if the resident wants someone else to represent her, that's fine. But that all comes from the resident. We are, the whole point of the nursing home standards is that it is resident-centered and it's focused on the resident, not focused on what we too often see is a top-down approach, is that this is our facility, this is how we conduct, certain things at A, B, C, D, and we check it off and we're done. No.
Right.
That's not good for a care plan. That's not good for actual care, et cetera.
Right. So, so Richard, if I can interject, just again from a broad standpoint, you're looking at the statement of deficiencies. That statement of deficiency concerns the admission, and underneath it is basically the investigation that was conducted and placed into the underneath the actual deficiency as a chronicling, as a record of how the inspector came to that information, which in this instance that you've highlighted was an interview with the actual resident. Sometimes it can be looking at the records of the resident. Sometimes it can be interviews with the staff, that kind of thing. Is that kind of
exactly? Yes, yeah, and I didn't highlight it all, but they did talk to the receptionist, they talked to director of nursing, they talked to other people on staff to find out, well, what is going on, and essentially nobody really knew. And to summarize it, they were sending out invitations to care plan meetings to family, but they had completely bypassed the resident who was cognitively able to participate.
Right, and
it just didn't make any sense.
Sure, and in reading these, Richard, do you get a sense that does the inspector, is there anything in terms of, I don't know, slant or bias in this? Because it seems like it should be taken down kind of like a police officer would. Like, I'm just taking down the facts. Is that kind of how these investigations are recorded, or do you see that the inspector is saying things like this is ridiculous or anything like that? Can you tell me the tone generally of the actual recording of the inspection?
Right, the tone is always very neutral. In fact, frankly, from our point of view, the tone tends to favor the position of the nursing home. So, what we're looking at here in terms of a violation of a regulation is different than a violation of the law. And that really gets at why so many problems we see in nursing homes are not cited adequately, is because too many surveyors, they operate as if they were Perry Mason.
Right.
And they have to have proof beyond a reasonable doubt, when in fact that is not true. If it was a court of law, that might be different. But here we're talking about substantiating whether there was a violation and who was affected by that violation.
Right. Okay.
And so everyone that I've ever seen, I've never seen one that interjected a personal opinion or that were subjective.
Right. I think I've seen somewhere. I feel like the inspector is definitely putting in some facts to make it, even though it's objective, to make it look like it's for one side or the other. I remember one where the individual made sure to note down that one of the nurses did not know how to use the hospital bed to lower or raise it.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And then, and then it said, like, called over, staff member XYZ who also could not do it. Even though it might not have had anything to do with what the actual deficiency was.
Right, and that's raises a really good point, because there's, we talk about staffing, and I mentioned in the last week in the program how important staffing is. And I think anyone who's been in a nursing home knows that. But there are really two aspects of that. One is having sufficient staff, and the other one is having staff with the appropriate trainings. And nursing homes are required to do both. It's really important for people to remember that they're not running a YMCA. It's not a hostel that they have set up 2 beds in a room, and they replace the toilet paper every couple of days. That's not it. They're getting paid a significant amount of money to meet these care requirements for a population that is very vulnerable.
Right.
And that's why these rules exist, and that is why they are so important. And I'm an advocate. The surveyors are not, but I'm an advocate. And I say, well, what are we doing to implement those protections and those residents' rights for residents? So, this one again that's why one reason why I chose it. It's not, there are some really horrible deficiencies that I'm sure you have seen and I've seen as well. But I think this gets at, in a very brief way, some of the ways, some important standards that are being violated, and gives us an opportunity to think about what that means. Now, if I may, the second person who they spoke about here, this person has resident number 2, she has been documented as having highly impaired hearing. And then it shows everything what they found. You'll see this in every statement of deficiency. So it goes day by day by day of who the surveyor spoke to, what records he or she looked at, and what she found. So here you can see that they reviewed the resident's care plan from February 18th. It documented that she had severe hearing loss, that certain things needed to take place, give her plenty of time to respond, rephrase words if she misunderstands, ensure that writing utensils are available and a writing board is present when communicating, face patient when speaking to her. So all these things that just make sense. And then it goes on to review, well, how is this violated? Review of nursing notes, dated October. So first it was February 18th of 2017, and October, the review of the survey, the review documented, that the resident had returned with a new hearing aid to the right ear. In March, the resident was observed by the surveyor sitting in her wheelchair in the hallway. When the surveyor tried to communicate with the resident pointed towards her ears and said she could not hear. The resident did not have any hearing aids in her ears. The resident was severely hard of hearing and did not have any hearing aids in her ears. Then they talked to a certified nurse aide. The nurse aide stated, I don't know if resident has hearing aids in place. No one has told me if she does. Getting back to staffing. The staff should know the needs of their residents, and the staff should be addressing needs of the residents. It's not a YMCA. It's not a hostel. It's a care environment. The survey goes on. The next day, around the same time, around midday, the resident was again observed working on a word find puzzle in her room. The resident, again, did not have any hearing aids in her ears. The resident's roommate was present, and stated she used to go to some activities, but quit going as much due to the fact that she couldn't hear what was going on.
That's terrible. I mean, like
right.
You get more and more isolated the less and less you hear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A couple hours later, again, the surveyor observed that she was sitting in a wheelchair in the hallway. When the surveyor started to speak to the resident again pointed to her ears and said, "They did not put them in. I can't hear you." The next day, the next afternoon, the surveyor spoke to the licensed practical nurse. The unit manager was interviewed at the nurse's station. The unit manager was asked why the resident had not been wearing hearing aids. The LPN was informed of the nurse's notes documenting that the resident had gotten a hearing aid last year. The LPN reported the resident's sister had talked to her about a couple of hours ago when she picked her up for a visit. The LPN stated, "I went downstairs to the laundry to see if maybe they were down there, the hearing aids, and they were not. So we'll continue to look for them." And they're completing a form to give the social services that will take care of replacing the hearing aids. And then the next day, on March 15th, in the afternoon, they spoke to the MDS coordinator for the facility, and she asked if the care plan had been revised so the staff would know that resident had hearing aids and to put them into the resident. The MDS coordinator reported she could not find it in the care plan. However, she believed the resident had 2 sets of hearing aids.
Let me ask you this, Richard. Over on the side under the F tag, it says level of harm. What are the different levels of harm?
That's a really good question. So when a surveyor goes into a nursing home and they find a violation, they rate it in terms of its scope and severity. So the severity can be from no harm or minimal harm or potential for harm up into the highest being that there was harm or a resident was put in immediate jeopardy. And then the residents affected, that's the other part of that scope and what we call scope and severity matrix, are either none, few, many, or widespread. So it's a matrix of how it's ranked. Now the problem here, I'm so glad that you raised it, is that our research and other research has shown that even when they find a healthcare violation, the states rarely identify resident harm. In fact, for 95% of all healthcare violations, no harm is identified. And in Georgia, actually, when I studied this in 2015, it was even worse. They only identified resident harm 3.5% of the time when there was a healthcare violation. And so if you look at this one, just to bring it back to this example, they found no harm. Now, could you imagine that you were in a nursing home for months, you were totally unable to hear. You lost interest in going to activities because they just had failed to provide you with the hearing aid.
It also looks like they've said level of harm is minimal harm or potential for every single one of these so far. They've said the same thing.
Yes, and that gets again at for Georgia. When we studied it, it was 96.5% of these violations are no harm. So I tell make sure when if anyone's looking at this, not to take that as meaning there was no actual harm. We actually have a new newsletter called the Elder Justice No Harm Newsletter that we capture these from around the country just to give examples of citations where no harm was identified, when we would say, I think a reasonable person would say, you know what, if this happened to me, I would say that it was harmful. If it happened to someone I loved, I would say that there was harm here.
Yeah.
The reason why it's so important to me as and to my work as an advocate is that when a nursing home is cited, it is extremely rare that they will face any penalty unless harm or immediate jeopardy are identified. Mm-hmm. So what that means is that for all these violations, for any violation that you see where there was not actual harm or immediate jeopardy written there in level of harm, the likelihood is that the facility did not have to face any penalty whatsoever. And what does that mean? That means that you are telling the facility this is okay. You are telling the facility, right with this example, essentially, that it's okay to not have an appropriate plan of care, to not be inviting residents to their own care planning,
right,
and not to have a hearing aid for them that they could, they have a hearing aid, but not in any way that they could use for, for days and days and days, and possibly months. We only know what this, what the surveyor found, but presumably she didn't come in on the first day. In fact, we know that from what the roommate said. The roommate said to the surveyor she used to participate in activities, but she doesn't any longer because she can't hear.
Well, Richard, those are good points, and my question now is, you've pointed out a couple of ways in which this document would not be an accurate reflection of what happened. So my question now is, as putting yourself in the shoes of someone who has a loved one in a nursing home, and you're trying to investigate, and you look at a document like this, what are some tips for actually culling and getting something useful from it? How can we use this document and understand,
what we're looking at,
and what we're looking for?
Well, I would say so. Especially if you're a family member or resident, or you're working with people in a specific facility, it is really useful to see, well, what kind of problems have been identified, so that they know what have they been doing to rectify them. Now, the federal government has required that every state not only publish the statement of deficiencies, but also that they publish the facility's plan of corrections. And I've been looking. I actually had a very hard time finding that on the Georgia website, but that is required to be there. We've been working with CMS to try to get this, to try to get them to hold the states accountable, because that would be extremely valuable. So right now, just with having the statement of deficiencies, you can see past citations, and those past citations are all too often they indicate persistent problems. We did some research a couple of years ago, and we found that nationwide, 42% of facilities had what we call chronic deficiencies. They were cited for the exact same regulatory deficiency, the exact same F tag, 3 times in the 3 years that are covered on Nursing Home Compare.
Yeah.
So it's instructive in that way to see, well, what is going on? And I'm not necessarily saying go in and say this is going to be a bad facility, but go in and say, well, what are you doing now to ensure that residents are included in care plans and that those care plans are followed?
So in short, you can use these documents, get the statement of deficiencies reports from the Nursing Home Compare website, look at what in general they're being cited for, and that's how you can, one piece of your decision whether or not to put your loved one in there. And obviously, if you're seeing things that are repetitive or you're seeing things that are major, then you go to the next facility.
Yeah, I would certainly, if I was seeing, here, seeing that they had 11 deficiencies. And I think what the statement of deficiencies does is it lets you get a sense of what that actually means, because the Nursing Home Compare, it only tells you the number. But this gives you a sense of, this person didn't have her hearing aid. There are other deficiencies here that really spell out that the next one is that I just scrolled down to was that they failed to provide care and assistance to perform activities of daily living for residents who are unable to, meaning that they had residents who, as many residents are, needed significant help with basic activities, bathing, dining, getting dressed, etc., and that they had failed to do that. And you could see how they failed to do that.
Right. And I just want to say to the audience that it might be looking at this or actually not, or just listening, these survey reports, the statement of deficiencies, they look jarbled. They look like they from a official logistical standpoint look incoherent, but when you actually read, it's not that difficult to understand and get a gist of what is being said. This isn't like reading some type of legal document. It's literally reading sometimes just what somebody said to another person. And it's not hard to digest. It looks hard to digest, but it is not if you get in there and start reading it.
Yes, and I think that's a really good point. As I said at the beginning, when I first started, I thought these were just they look so complex and they look so dense, but actually they each one of them tells a story. I mean, what we just talked about is that you can imagine the surveyor was there and she saw the resident sitting in the hall, and she tried to speak to the resident as surveyors should be doing, and the resident couldn't speak because she didn't have her hearing aid. And then, every day the survey came back, and every day it was just, more, it was clear that, the resident wasn't being given a hearing aid, hadn't had a hearing aid for a long period of time, that it had deleteriously affected her quality of life and ability to communicate. I mean, imagine what it would be like if you couldn't hear, and how unpleasant that would be for those of us who have hearing. And then imagine if you're stuck in a nursing home where you can't really watch TV, you can't really hear what's going on. It affects your communication with people who are providing care to you. It affects your communication with other residents. The nursing homes tend to be so isolating to begin with. Yeah, that is compounded so much, and people recognize it. I mean, the rules recognize it, and the rules make sense. Is that address those needs, and the fact is that they didn't. But are they being held accountable?
That's exactly right. And thank you very much, Richard, for guiding us through this. For those listeners that don't already know, even though you've told who you are 6 different times on this podcast, but let our audience know how they can get in touch with you and where they can get further information about understanding these documents.
Sure. My name is Richard Mollot with the Long-Term Care Community Coalition, and our website is nursinghome411.org. And we actually we have a lot of information. We try to compress it down, that is as user-friendly as possible for people to see what kind of violations are going on in their nursing homes, how often their states fine nursing homes, what antipsychotic drugging rates are, in nursing homes, staffing rates in separate nursing homes, et cetera, so that you can kind of see what is, get a different sense of what is going on as easily as possible. We really want people to have the tools that are available. Oh, and if I may, we actually have a number of fact sheets and a dementia care toolkit on our website. And for each one of the fact sheets, we take a standard, such as the one that you see here, and we give you the FTAG number, we give you the citation to the federal code, but what we do is we then just explain it very basically. This is what the resident right is. This is what you can do to understand and to advocate for your resident to get that right in his or her facility.
Yeah, I was going to say.
So please, they're all free. All the resources are free.
Exactly. Well, Richard, again, thank you for that very much. We look forward to having you back on the podcast in the near future.
Great. Thank you both.
All right.
Thanks, Richard.
Have a good one.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right. Well, that was, as always, it's really helpful having Richard on here. Richard is somebody that's been working with long-term care issues for a very long time, and the LCCC, the Nursing Home 411 website, Consumer Voice. So it's good to have somebody like him break down what to look for. And it's also just good advice. Go online, go to Nursing Home Compare. Don't just look at the, the star ratings, but also go there and download that statement of deficiencies.
Yeah, go get those statement of deficiencies. Look at what the surveyor says.
And read them and see that there may be situations like the one that we looked at where they didn't put a woman's hearing aids in, or somebody wasn't invited to a care plan meeting. So know what types of problems are out there. But yeah, it's really good information, very important. Very good having Richard on as always.
That's right. Well, great. Well, I guess that will conclude this particular episode of the Nursing Home Abuse Podcast. As always, there are 2 ways that you consume each and every episode, which come out Monday mornings. The first way is to go to your favorite application where you download your podcasts, such as Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Google, whatever Google has now. I think it's Google Play, Google
Play,
Google something.
Yeah,
and then podcast Pound Puppies. You can do it that way, or you can watch, which we always suggest that you watch, particularly this episode. Of any episodes to watch, to put on your 3D glasses.
Yeah, you
put on your 3D glasses now.
Yeah.
This is the episode because there's going to be some documents that you want to see as Richard was talking.
Yeah, but so you can go to nursinghomeabusepodcast.com.
Or our YouTube channel.
Yeah.
And with that, we will see you next time.
See you next time. Thanks for tuning in to the Nursing Home Abuse Podcast. Nothing said on this podcast, either by the host or the guest, should be construed as legal advice, nor is intended to create an attorney-client relationship between the host or their guest and the listener. New episodes are available every Monday on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, or on your favorite podcast app, as well as on YouTube and our website, nursinghomeabusepodcast.com. Again, that's nursinghomeabusepodcast.com. See you next time.